Story 1. My dad was not the cook, but when he had to prepare a meal, his fallback was taco salad. It was simple and delicious. However, we had it so often that it became tedious and I grew to dislike it. I haven't had it in years, and now it's a family joke. He has recently passed away, and I would give anything for some taco salad now. Story 2. My mom used to make a meal that my dad supposedly loved. It was bean soup, which is exactly what you think it is. A bunch of cooked beans with minimal seasoning in water or broth. It felt like the meal equivalent of jury duty. Story 3. My mother's shake and bake pork chops were made from the cheapest, most gristly cut, baked until devoid of moisture. Just thinking about trying to chew them makes my jaw hurt. It wasn't until my 30s that I ordered a pork chop at a restaurant and discovered that pork chops can be juicy and delicious. Then I felt like I was reborn. Story 4. My mom used to make pasta with a thick flour and cream-based sauce. I always felt sick afterward. I discovered in my mid-20s that I have celiac disease and lactose intolerance. Story 5. Meatloaf. My mom made the worst meatloaf. Then I tried making it myself after I was on my own and found a much better recipe. Now it is amazing. Story 6. My dad made a pot roast every once in a while. He would put the roast into a slow cooker, cover it with water, add no seasoning, include a yellow onion and some carrots, and then cook for 12 hours. It was like eating wet leather. Story 7. My father once forced me to eat a container of butter because it came from a healthy farm or something like that. I sobbed my way through the whole thing. Story 8. My mother's goulash was overcooked macaroni, ground beef, and plain, unseasoned, watery tomato sauce. Story 9. My mom would make something she called teriyaki chicken. It was completely burnt and dry, boneless, skinless chicken breast with no seasoning, not even salt, and a small ramekin of soy sauce on the side. Don't forget the vitamins. Story 10. Those little individual pot pies took a long time to cook in the oven, and the filling remained extremely hot for too long, often burning my mouth. The meat consisted of gristle, the bottom was always soggy, and the gravy had an unusual texture with no flavor. Story 11. Spaghetti with sauce from a tin can, no meat, no cheese. I also can't eat ramen noodles anymore. Story 12. Because one of my siblings passed away, my mother became convinced that the regular food we ate killed him and was harming us. She was already health conscious, so there were no unhealthy snacks, processed foods, sodas, or sugary drinks in our house. Any form of sugary dessert was a rare treat. However, our lives were completely upended, and we went from a relatively healthy American diet to an extreme vegetarian or vegan diet. This was in the 1980s when food options for that lifestyle were not nearly as varied as they are now. We transitioned from regular milk to soy milk and from meat to tofu. However, the absolute worst meal was that some mornings for breakfast my mother would serve us sprouted wheat. It was simply dry wheat that she had soaked until it began to sprout. Then we could add toppings like shredded coconut, raisins, and shredded apple. A little honey could be added, but not too much, and we would pour some soy milk over it. It was simply awful. If we were lucky, the wheat had just sprouted, which was unpleasant but edible. If it had sprouted a few days earlier, it tasted like grass, and even with soy milk, it was unbearably dry. I still feel nauseous just thinking about it. I know my mother was genuinely terrified and had good intentions, but the situation was quite traumatic for my siblings and me. She would catch us sneaking normal food and become really upset with us. Story 13. One time I told my mom I wanted some rice pudding. She grabbed some for me at the store. I looked at it and realized I meant bread pudding. Anyway, decades later my mom still thinks I love rice pudding and gets it for me. I'm not a big fan of it. Story 14. Congee is essentially rice porridge. My mom used to force us to eat it occasionally as a sort of palate cleanser. As a proper dish, congee is meant to have spices, sauces, and toppings, but my mom never included any of that. It was just rice and water. It was incredibly bland. One time, in an attempt to bribe us, my mom heated up some Hot Pockets. The only ones we had at the time were the ham and cheese variety, and for some reason I didn't like the cheese, so the bribe didn't work on me. Since the bribe failed, my mom dragged me into the kitchen and scolded me. Eventually, I made my way back to the dinner table, where my mom threw down a bun and yelled at me to eat it. I was sobbing while eating, pretending to enjoy it because I thought that would stop me from getting in more trouble. She yelled that I was just pretending to enjoy it, and that's the last thing I remember from that night. My friends have insisted that my mom just made it wrong, but at this point, I won't eat it at all. Making congee the proper way doesn't change my memory of that night. For a decade, I also refused to eat Hot Pockets. The only reason I started eating them again was that I tried a different filling without realizing it was still a Hot Pocket. Story 15. Creamed eggs on toast were not great. It indicated that we were low on money. Hard-boiled eggs were mashed, flour and milk were stirred together, and then poured over toast. Story 16. Fried salmon patties with ketchup are not to my taste. My mom used canned salmon, added nothing, formed a patty, dredged it in unseasoned cornmeal, and pan-fried it. Now, I prepare salmon patties using Ina Garten's recipe for crab cakes, substituting salmon for crab, as I am allergic to crab. They are delicious. Story 17. My dad made London broil every weekend for years. It's fine. My dad is an excellent cook, and the sides were always well prepared. But every weekend was too much. A few times a summer? Sure. But this was all he would ever cook on Saturday or Sunday. Story 18. I once saw my granddad eating tongue on a sandwich, and he convinced me to try it. A solid no. Don't do it. Story 19. My mother makes a delicious chicken soup, which she used as a cure-all for everything. For years, it felt like one pot of soup fixed everything in the world. Then I developed a mysterious ailment. My mother didn't know what to do. She kept feeding me chicken soup and took me to doctor after doctor. As her desperation grew and the tests kept coming back negative, the doctors became increasingly untrustworthy. I just wouldn't get better. I felt like a zombie. Instead of succulent brains, all I was given was more chicken soup. I lived off that soup on and off, but mostly on, for 3 years. Finally, I was accurately diagnosed by a man my mother summoned out of retirement, as if she were assembling a team. Eventually, through the power of youth, a few surgeries, and that chicken soup, my body repaired itself. To this day, I cannot stand that delicious soup. Story 20. Tuna helper is one of the most unpleasant dishes ever created by humans. I hope whoever thought it was a great idea is facing the consequences of that decision. Story 21. Liver and onions. My nana would also add bean sprouts to hamburger meat. The texture would make me gag. Story 22. Mrs. Paul's fish sticks. I hated them so much that I wouldn't eat any fish for many years. Now I'm all good, but I'll never eat frozen fish sticks again. Story 23. One pan bacon-wrapped chicken and rice. No seasoning. Basically, plain semi-cooked bacon wrapped around chicken boiled in milk and soft rice. It was horrific. Story 24. Coronado beef casserole, but only because I had eaten it while sick. I threw up that night, got a tortilla chip lodged in my sinuses, and had to try to sleep it off. It was truly a traumatic experience for an 8-year-old. Story 25. My grandma grew up during the Great Depression. She made patties of ground liver and raisins coated in flour. Just the smell. Story 26. I disliked eating rice. No matter what it was served with, I found it unappealing and would take 4 hours to finish. It's a shame because my mother made an effort to prepare varied meals, and she is an excellent cook. I was just an annoying and picky child. Now I cannot go more than a week without eating rice. Story 27. My dad had a girlfriend who only knew how to cook spaghetti, and she would make it 3 times a week. It was terrible. I still won't eat spaghetti today, over 40 years later. Story 28. I am 50 and I still dislike canned tuna. It is the only food that I refuse to eat. Story 29. Frozen fish sticks and canned peas during Lent were the worst. Finally, my mom realized that cheese pizza was a viable option. The best meal was the seafood feast from Captain D's. Story 30. My mom used to make this breakfast casserole every Christmas morning. It was all the leftovers she had available, mixed into eggs and baked. Many years, this concoction turned out poorly, but none of my 5 siblings ever said a thing. It was years after we were all out of the house that she took it much better than expected. Story 31. Some dish my mom called Mowgli Googly to make it seem fun. It was Kraft macaroni mixed with ground beef, canned lesueur peas, and canned carrots. Story 32. My mom microwaved breaded shrimp, which were chopped bits of shrimp formed into a shrimp shape. Just because microwaves were new and the package said you could microwave it does not mean you should. I can still smell it in my nightmares. Story 33. My mother made homemade burgers look like hockey pucks. I wish I were joking. They were covered in at least a 1/4 inch of solid black burn all the way around. She was convinced that hamburgers on the grill had to be cooked that way or they weren't done. I hated homemade hamburgers until I met my husband. My husband is a quiet man, but the first time he saw my mom doing this, he asked me if she realized that she was burning them. I didn't know better at the time and said that was how they were supposed to be. Without saying anything at all, my husband got up and took over the cooking. He never let my mom cook hamburgers on the grill again, and I started enjoying homemade hamburgers. Story 34. Pierogies. My mom boiled them using unbaked dough filled with half-boiled potatoes. I had a strong gag reflex with those. Story 35. Tacos, but my mom didn't use any seasoning, so it was plain ground beef, shredded cheese, and maybe salsa if we were lucky. However, I disliked the kind of salsa she bought, so it was hardly an improvement. I also disliked having to eat tuna sandwiches because I really dislike fish and I really dislike Miracle Whip, as she refused to buy regular mayonnaise. We were never allowed to have something else for dinner if we didn't like what was being served. Story 36. My mom is still a good cook, but she excels at foods that don't require many spices or seasonings not found in a pre-made mix. She used to make Chinese stir-fry with chicken and vegetables. To compensate for her lack of understanding of Chinese spices, she would use an entire small bottle of soy sauce. She would cook everything separately, including rice, then mix it together in a bowl and add a small bottle of soy sauce. It was overwhelmed with salt and not edible. She thought it was fantastic. It's amazing that her blood pressure isn't sky high. Story 37. To be honest, I just ate whatever was in front of me. We didn't have much money, so we didn't have a lot of food. I guess the one I hated the most was bologna. That stuff was really unpleasant. I mean, I still ate it, but it was gross. Story 38. Pork chops. I absolutely despised them. All the gristle and fat were so unappealing. I remember only ever eating a small section of them. Such a waste. I also didn't really like steak much, but pork chops were the worst. Appropriately, I have been a lifelong vegetarian and vegan since my childhood. Story 39. Peas. I couldn't leave the table until I finished them, so I would drown them in ketchup and swallow them like pills. I love peas now, but green bell peppers can still be avoided. Story 40. Chinese chicken salad. Not because it's a bad dish and my mom did an okay job, but I was always starving after eating it. My mom and dad would eat it occasionally because they were trying to be healthier, but I was a growing teenager on the wrestling team and needed more food. Story 41. Not a meal. A side dish of canned peas or canned lima beans. Val then, val now. Fresh peas or fresh lima beans straight from the garden. Oh yes. Canned? No thanks. Story 42. Gas station hot dogs were a staple when I had to get up early for work. Not only was I dragged out of bed at 4 or 5 a.m., but I would also be handed a hot dog from a 24-hour gas station that had no chance of being freshly placed on the roller. Story 43. Beef mince in gravy, mashed potatoes, and peas. I often ate the mince quickly and had to run to the toilet to spit it out. Story 44. Bitter melon soup was filled with a mix of ground pork, rice vermicelli noodles, and seasonings. Every time our parents would tell us it wasn't as bitter as the last time they made it. It was a lie every single time. Story 45. This is going to be really weird to explain, but 2 things. Chicken fingers and Reese's Puffs. Not because of how they taste, but for other reasons. I love chicken, but as a child, my parents used to buy these odd, rubbery Halloween props of severed fingers during the Halloween season, along with bones and brains. For whatever reason, The name chicken fingers forces my brain to remember the unpleasant smell of those Halloween severed finger props and the disgusting stretchy texture I encountered whenever I ate chicken fingers. Just the name brings it all back. It's a bizarre reason, but I swear that's the main reason I disliked chicken fingers as a child. As for Reese's Puffs, I can't stand them solely because they resemble rabbit droppings. Story 46. Sliced S-bar hot dogs and great value off-brand Kraft box macaroni and cheese. I cannot stomach those flavors, either together or separately. Story 47. It was a salty white gravy with bits of meat poured over regular toast. My mom called it stuff on shingles. It was unappetizing, and the name made it even less appealing to eat. Story 48. I grew up in a very rural town on a reservation in the middle of cattle country. There were very few parts of the beef, pig, deer, elk, antelope, or moose that we did not eat. In those days, only the wealthy had bison. I have eaten every cut of muscle and almost every organ from the beef. This was not prepared with gourmet techniques or fancy spices. I feel queasy just thinking about eating roasted guts, grilled kidneys, breaded liver, heart stuffed with cornbread and wrapped in bacon, marrow, sweetbreads, and brains. My neighbor had a special mug he would only use for beef brains. He would crack a beef skull and cook the brains with eggs and sausage. He would get super excited on butchering day, knowing he would have brains and eggs the next morning. Story 49. Mom made cow liver one night. She is a great natural cook, but she was told never to make that again. It was a unanimous decision among the 7 of us. Story 50. I disliked meat as a child. My mom cooked all meat until it was thoroughly done. I thought meat was something you chewed to get the flavor from, then spat out the remnants. The first time my ex-husband cooked for me, it was chicken breast. It was so juicy and melted in my mouth that I thought it had gone bad. It didn't take me long to realize I loved meat of all kinds if it was cooked well. He was an amazing cook. I lost 50 pounds when we split up. I miss his lasagna the most. Story 51. The horrible chicken and rice with mushroom soup. My mom made it all the time and everyone else liked it. I would take bites and spit it out into anything I could find. Story 52. Mom's protest meal was based on an agreement with my dad that once a week she wouldn't cook. If arrangements fell through, it meant a can of spaghetti with lightly cooked onions and a can of cube Spam, basically warmed up. Story 53. When I was growing up, I thought I hated chicken until I realized that my mom just wasn't skilled at cooking it. Once I got a little older and started eating out on my own and learning how to cook for myself, I had to accept the harsh reality that my mom simply wasn't a good cook. Unfortunately, home cooking doesn't mean much to me. Story 54. My mother liked to put pork chops in a glass pan with a pinch of seasoning salt and pepper and bake them until they were as dry as sand. I hate all pork chops to this day, dry or not. Story 55. When my parents were separated, my dad made spaghetti almost every night because it was the only thing he knew how to prepare. As an adult, I understand he was doing his best. But if I never eat spaghetti again, it will be too soon. Story 56. Baked boneless, skinless chicken breast with mixed vegetables and beets. My mother was always on a failed diet, and my taste buds suffered as a result. Story 57. My mom used to use canned spinach as a healthy side occasionally. I liked it as a kid, but since reaching adulthood and discovering that spinach is a leaf and not a congealed, salty mush, the canned variety makes me gag. Canned green beans, on the other hand, are still delicious. Story 58. My mom is a great cook, so it isn't her fault, but sweet potatoes make me gag due to their texture, smell, and flavor. I dreaded it each time they appeared in the kitchen. Story 59. My mom was really worried about foodborne illness, so she would cook any meats we had thoroughly. The dry chicken I could at least chew and swallow, but the gray, rubbery steaks I would sit and chew endlessly, eventually just spitting out the flavorless, fibrous clump. It was considered my fault for not finishing dinner. Story 60. She used to make green jello that had globs of mayonnaise whisked into it. There was also a can of pineapple juice and chopped walnuts added. It was sliced into large cubes and placed atop a full leaf of iceberg lettuce, then garnished with a tiny squirt of whipped cream and half of a maraschino cherry. We had to eat it with a special spork-type utensil from her bridal set, which only came out for special occasions that warranted the green dish. Story 61. My father made a dish he called glop. It was a horrific offshoot of shepherd's pie. It was terrible. He loved to tell me about his secret ingredients. A bit of sugar and some nutmeg. I'm still traumatized 30 years later. Story 62. Born in 1952, we were not flush with money. My mom would take the cheapest piece of beef, full of gristle, and have me run next door to borrow the meat hatchet. It was a multi-bladed tool that she would use to tenderize the beef. She pan-fried it, covered it with canned chopped tomatoes, and served it with the ever-present mashed potatoes. As a kid, there were some pieces I almost wore my jaw out trying to chew. Story 63. Potato soup. It was watered-down milk, onions, and not enough potato. We were poor, so that probably explains it. I usually just skipped this meal since I got free food at school. About 5 years ago, I bought my mom a meal kit subscription, and she learned how to make loaded baked potato chowder, which is delicious. We haven't seen the potato soup since, and that is the best money I've ever spent. Story 64. Grape juice, grape jelly, or anything artificially grape-flavored does not taste remotely like grapes. Story 65. Back in the 1980s, my mom used to make chicken curry. Let me tell you, people in Arkansas during that time had no idea what real Indian curry should taste like. It was the most unpleasant creation I've ever endured. Just enough odd spice combinations to seem foreign, but lacking the proper blend and undoubtedly missing some key ingredients. It wouldn't be until college that I finally ate proper Indian food, which I love. Story 66. Chicken feet, head sausage, and pig ears. I grew up on a farm in the German area of Texas. My mother wasted nothing. Story 67. I didn't eat it, but I hated whenever my dad decided to make pork hocks and sauerkraut. The smell permeated the entire house. I couldn't bring myself to get close enough to the food to actually try it. Neither my mom nor I understood how my dad could eat it. Story 68. Milk. I had to drink it at dinner, and I hated the taste. Years later, I discovered I also have a sensitivity to it. I haven't researched this, but I suspect the idea that you need milk for calcium was promoted by the milk industry. Story 69. My mom would make fried rice with egg, similar to stir-fried rice, but it lacked flavor, along with a tomato and cucumber salad with mayonnaise. That was her go-to meal. She is a great cook, but that dish was not appealing. Story 70. Porcupine meatballs. I believe my family got it from the Betty Crocker cookbook. I still do not like it. Here is the recipe though. Story 71. Macaroni without sauce is simply plain macaroni with bell peppers, onion, and sausage cut into pieces. I still cannot eat macaroni-shaped pasta without experiencing war flashbacks. Story 72. Potato surprise. Instant mashed potatoes in a casserole dish, add ground beef and sauce. Essentially sloppy Joe ingredients. Cover with more potatoes and a sprinkle of cheese. It's similar to shepherd's pie without any wholesome ingredients. Overcooked everything. Anything grilled was tough and dry, and vegetables, if they didn't come from a can, were cooked to mush. Story 73. Beef stroganoff hamburger helper. My aunt made me sit at the table until I ate everything. I vomited all over the place. This began my journey with eating disorders. Thanks, Aunt Mary. Story 74. I had no idea I liked pork chops and biscuits until I moved out of my parents' house and had them cooked properly. To this day, my mother turns pork chops into inedible shoe leather, and her biscuits are the metallic-tasting kind that you have to smack the can on the counter to open. Story 75. Salisbury steak. At school, at home, at friends' houses, and at restaurants, it was everywhere during my childhood in the 1990s. I couldn't escape it. Story 76. Not a meal but pickles. True story. In the summer after first grade, I stayed at my friend's house for the day. His mom said, "Eat your pickle, fun bike." My son is eating his pickle. I moaned, "I don't like pickles," as I lightly chewed the tip of the pickle without swallowing any of it. His mom encouraged me, "Oh, fun bike, just take a big bite." I crunched down, taking a huge bite, and then I threw up all over the table, with it running over the sides onto the floor. That's what happens when you force a kid to eat something he really hates. By the way, I love pickles as an adult. Story 77. Fish sticks with ketchup and mayonnaise. I would forfeit my entire night to avoid eating them. Now I love them so much. Who knew they made the best fish tacos? Story 78. Spaghetti. My grandma always added bell peppers. I hated it. Now I can't live without it. Cannot explain. Story 79. Cabbage rolls. If I came home from school and smelled them, I would announce that I was going to my room and wouldn't be eating that night. For better or worse, when I grew up, if you didn't eat your dinner, you went to your room hungry. My mom would usually sneak me a sandwich or something later when my dad wasn't around. Story 80. I would have to take all the apples from the pot to even consider swallowing it. I still cannot stand them. Story 81. My mom's tuna casserole. My dad didn't like it either, so whenever that was what was for dinner, we knew she was upset with him. Story 82. Chicken Kiev. I haven't had it since, so I might even like it now, but just the smell of it used to make me feel sick. What parents often do not realize is that children have a much stronger sense of taste and smell, so overly intense flavors can be overwhelming. Story 83. Fish made my head itch and I had trouble breathing. I would have a breakdown whenever I had to eat fish. I was told I was being picky and needed to deal with it. As an adult, it turns out I have a severe fish allergy that puts me at risk of going into anaphylaxis. Story 84. Once when I was a kid, we had no real food left. We were very poor. We had eaten the last of the canned goods, and in the frost of the freezer, we found an old, half-eaten container of chicken livers we had given to the cat when he had been sick months before. My mom's friend said he could make it for us and that it would be good. It was the worst thing I have ever put in my mouth, and the smell was horrible. He suggested adding some ketchup, and that somehow made it worse. I vomited. Then my stomach hurt until school breakfast the next day. Never again. Story 85. Mom found a recipe in Good Housekeeping for a Frito casserole. Tasted very bad. Chili with cheese and Frito corn chips mixed in isn't bad at all. But the way the recipe was written turned it into an underseasoned, gooey dish of baked blandness that was unpleasant. Somehow, she decided it was a family favorite, even though we would all say that we weren't very hungry every time she made it. To prevent leftovers, I would ask to take the whole casserole dish to my bedroom and instead dump the food out my window for the neighborhood animals to feast on. Story 86. So my dad cooks, and so do I. I love to cook. My mom bakes reasonably well, but she did make two things. One, my grandmother's spaghetti sauce, exactly from her handwritten recipe. It's great because she follows a wonderful recipe. Her mother's macaroni and cheese, which is terrible. Her mother was an Irish alcoholic who disliked doing anything for anyone, including cooking. But my mom grew up with it, so it was nostalgic for her. To me, it was a nightmare. In a casserole dish, add overcooked elbow macaroni with unseasoned tomato sauce, layer it with copious amounts of American cheese, and then bake. This is unpleasant as it sounds. Story 87. I don't think my parents made a lot of bad food, but I never could come around to sloppy joes. They were soggy, mushy, messy, and didn't taste good enough to make up for it. Story 88. A cold slab of Oscar Mayer bologna. One slice of Kraft cheese thrown onto a sandwich of white Wonder Bread with a big smear of mayonnaise. Good grief, that was horrible. Oh, and Campbell's cream of mushroom soup, vile, nasty gray-looking stuff, and the mushrooms had the texture of big slugs sliding down my throat. I apologize to all the companies I mentioned. I know they make products that many people love, but to a 10-year-old kid's palate, not so much. Story 89. My mom would force-feed me a milk and ripe banana smoothie every morning. I disliked it. Now I dislike ripe bananas and prefer them when the peel is mostly yellow with a little green because ripe bananas cause me distress. Story 90. Anything with green bell pepper makes my stomach turn at the mere smell of them being cut. Just green bell pepper, too. Story 91. My mom, God love her, followed recipes to a T. If it called for a teaspoon of salt, it received exactly 1 teaspoon of salt. Every meal was flavorless. Story 92. Interestingly enough, it's a dessert. Spiced peaches and cream. It sounds inoffensive enough and could actually be quite tasty with some cinnamon, allspice, and clove-spiced canned peaches and whipped cream. However, the spice in the home canned peaches included heavy cumin and fennel seed. The cream on the recipe card was sour cream, but it was usually served with cottage cheese. Even with my grown-up palate and regular use of cumin and fennel seed in my own cooking, even in some sweet treats, the canned peaches just didn't work for me, and I've never liked cottage cheese. Story 93. Most of the meals were unpleasant. My mom was an average cook and quite self-centered. I think she enjoyed watching us eat what she prepared, often forcing us to consume unchewable items. We had to swallow it regardless. I choked many times and developed a strong aversion to chewy meat, which is why I no longer eat meat. The vegetables were gray and lacked seasoning. She rarely ate what she prepared for the rest of us. Story 94. My grandmother used to babysit me occasionally when I was a child. Her favorite food was pimento cheese sandwiches, so I had to eat those whenever I was with her. Honestly, I don't even remember what they taste like anymore, and I prefer not to. When my father cooked, it was usually only pork chops or cheeseburgers. More often than not, it was pork chops. Story 95. My mom made a simple dish where she would slice hot dogs down the middle, lay them on white bread, put a piece of American cheese on top, and cook it under the broiler. I still dislike hot dogs and American cheese. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.